The high beams shone directly into my windshield, and the car was already blocking the only exit from the rest stop when I realized it wasn't a coincidence. I still had my seatbelt unfastened, the door was ajar, and the idling engine was vibrating differently than usual. The dark sedan had no visible front license plate, and no one got out. The maneuvering space was far too tight for a group of 53 feet, and I quickly understood that if I waited for any movement from them, I would be stuck there. I was driving east on I-10, a sealed load of dry cargo auto parts, leaving Houston with a scheduled delivery to Mobile the following morning. Nothing unusual, nothing that would draw attention. Weight within the standard, documentation in order. I stopped at that Louisiana rest stop just to use the bathroom and stretch my legs. It wasn't a notorious spot for problems. It was just another well-lit space in the middle of nowhere. It was past 2 in the morning, almost no movement. 2 trucks further away, engines off, dark cabins, an old trailer parked near the trees, seemingly abandoned. The wind came damp from the swamp, carrying that heavy smell that clings to clothes. There were no open shops, just a vending machine and an overly bright flickering light on the lamppost. I left the truck pointed towards the exit when I parked, a habit of someone who prefers to leave easily. I didn't completely turn off the engine, just left it idling. The dashboard was normal, air pressure stable. The tank was still more than half full. Nothing indicated that I would be there for more than 10 minutes. When I returned from the bathroom, I noticed the dark sedan was already in the parking lot. It wasn't there when I arrived. It was parked near the entrance, engine running, low beam headlights on. I thought it was someone waiting for a ride or a late driver. I didn't pay much attention. I just wanted to continue my journey. The detail was the way he moved as soon as I got into the cab. It wasn't fast. It was calculated. He slowly pulled out of his parking spot and crossed the exit diagonally, occupying exactly the space I needed to line up the horse. He didn't honk. He didn't make a gesture. He just stood there, and nobody got out of the car. I kept the engine idling and stared out the windshield for a few seconds, trying to figure out if it was just recklessness or something I'd planned. The space to the right had a curb that was too high for the rear axle to climb. To the left, a lamppost and a shallow ditch. The sedan was exactly in the right spot, not too close, not far enough away for me to ignore. I picked up my cell phone from the dashboard, not to make a call but to have it in my hand. The signal was fluctuating. Just 1 bar. I thought about honking, but honking announces haste. Haste betrays nervousness. I preferred to observe. The driver's side window of the sedan was too dark to see who was inside. The car remained running. Headlights fixed on me. I glanced in my right rearview mirror and noticed movement near the old trailer parked among the trees. A shadow shifted and stopped. It might have been the wind. It might not have been. The distance wasn't helping. I felt the first change in my breathing rhythm right there. It wasn't just a badly parked car. I slowly put the truck in reverse as if just adjusting its position. The sedan moved forward 1/2 meter alongside it. Not much. Just enough to maintain the lock. That removed any doubt. It wasn't carelessness. It was space control. I'd seen a similar attempt at a smaller gas station in Mississippi years ago. That's when I noticed something small on the ground, about 20 feet in front of my truck. A dark, low object, difficult to distinguish with the headlights. It looked like a piece of rubber or metal. It was exactly in the line I would use if I tried to force my way out from the side. It wasn't there when I parked, and that changed everything. I moved forward a few centimeters just to improve the angle and better illuminate the ground. The object reflected a short flash. It wasn't rubber. It had metallic edges. Too small to be a common obstacle, large enough to burst a directional tire if I drove over it at the wrong angle. It wasn't lying there by chance. It was positioned. The sedan's high beams switched off for a second and then switched back on, as if someone inside was adjusting something. The passenger window rolled down a few centimeters. I didn't hear a voice, just an arm resting on the window, motionless. The car wasn't moving forward. It wasn't going backward. It maintained the exact distance. I looked again in the right rearview mirror. The shadow near the trailer was no longer in the same spot. It was closer to the illuminated area, still out of the bright light's reach. I wasn't rushing. I was coming at the right pace. Too slow to be lost. Too fast to be distracted. The truck radio crackled with interference. It wasn't direct communication, just static coming and going. Even so, in that silence, any noise seemed like a message. I turned off the radio. The sound of the engine became more prominent, constant vibration, but I felt a slight oscillation when I touched the accelerator, as if something was slightly out of adjustment. I stepped on the brake and felt a normal response, but lower than minutes before. The pressure was there, but not firm as it should be. It wasn't a complete failure. It was a subtle difference. And that, added to the car locking up, the object on the ground, and the approaching shadow, formed a pattern that didn't seem to fit with chance. Something had been set up there before I got back into the cabin. Before I could even decide anything, the sedan's driver's door opened. Not completely, just enough for someone to put a foot out. The interior light flickered on for half a second and then went out. I couldn't see the face, just the controlled movement of someone who wasn't in a hurry. At the same time, I felt the truck tilt slightly to the left. Very slightly, but enough for me to look at the dashboard again. The air pressure was still within acceptable limits, but dropping slowly. It wasn't a sudden malfunction. It was a small leak. Progressive. Something I didn't have when I parked. The shadow cast by the trailer stopped now behind my trailer, out of my direct field of vision. I adjusted the convex mirror, but the light didn't reach everything. I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't hear a voice. Just that heavy silence that precedes something bad. The arm resting on the sedan's window made a short gesture, pointing towards the ground in the direction of the metallic object, as if he wanted me to notice, as if he were reminding me that if I tried to force my way out that way, I would pay dearly. This wasn't improvisation. It was a choice of scenery. And then I felt the brake pedal go down a little more than it should, even without me pressing hard. The consequence was already happening. It wasn't just an external lock. Something had been messed with in my system while I was outside the cabin, and waiting there would only make the situation worse. I didn't wait for the pressure to drop any further. I engaged first gear, accelerated firmly, and threw the steering wheel all the way to the right, mounting part of the curb even though I knew it would strain the axle. The truck responded heavily, but it responded. I heard the dry sound of the tires scraping concrete. I didn't run over the metal object. I went over the limit. The sedan moved forward, trying to close the gap, but I was already in motion. The man who had opened the door quickly backed inside. The back of my trailer almost touched the lamppost when I aligned it. It was a very narrow margin. The brakes weren't as firm, so I used the engine more than the pedal. As soon as I got onto the track, I accelerated beyond what was comfortable for that stretch of road. The air pressure continued to drop slowly. It wasn't a complete failure, but I knew I wouldn't last much longer. The dashboard started beeping intermittently. Nothing dramatic, just enough of a warning to confirm that they had tampered with something. I drove about 4 miles to the next larger, well-lit gas station with an open shop and visible cameras. I drove straight into the brightest area and stopped near the main door. When I got out to inspect, I found the hose on one of the air lines with a clean, small, almost surgical cut. It wasn't wear and tear. It was a tool. The front right tire had a deep impact mark on the sidewall from the curb. It didn't burst, but it was damaged. Result: mandatory replacement, roadside assistance call, delivery delay, and a report for the company. Nothing that would have disrupted the route, but enough to directly impact my finances and my monthly bonus. While waiting for the mechanic, I mentally reviewed the minutes I left the truck unattended. It wasn't long, no more than 10 minutes. Enough to cut an airline and position an obstacle on the ground. Enough to set up a calculated roadblock. The local police came by after the gas station manager called. I filed a simple report, describing a dark car, no visible front license plate, 2 individuals, maybe 3. Nothing concrete, no clear image. The rest stop was too small to have a working camera. They took notes and moved on to another incident. The company deducted part of the damage from my performance bonus because the tire change and the delay generated extra costs. It wasn't huge, but it hurt, especially because it wasn't a spontaneous mechanical failure. It was someone testing how long I would stay stopped. I went back out on the road that same night close to dawn. Every time I saw a car slowing down behind me, I adjusted my mirror sooner than usual. It wasn't fear, it was calculation, a change of pattern. Today, when I stop at an isolated rest stop in Louisiana, the engine no longer idles. Either I stay in the cab, or I don't stop. Because that time, the roadblock wasn't to steal cargo. It was to see if I would hesitate, and I almost hesitated. If that first story got your attention, leave a like and drop a comment. It tells YouTube to recommend these stories to more people and helps the channel grow. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I recognized the car for the third time when it appeared in my rearview mirror as I was leaving Columbia, Missouri, and that's when I stopped treating it as a coincidence. I'm 41 years old. My name is Garrett, and I've driven enough to know when something starts repeating a pattern. The light-colored sedan wasn't overtaking, disappearing, or tailgating. It just maintained the same distance behind my trailer, too consistent to be random. After the third city, it stopped being a coincidence. I was driving west on I-70, a regular dry cargo truck, pallets of construction material leaving St. Louis with a scheduled delivery to Kansas City early the following afternoon. Nothing too valuable, nothing that warranted special attention. Weight within the limit, seal checked twice before leaving the yard. The weather was clear, open skies, moderate traffic for a Tuesday. It was the kind of route you drive almost automatically. The first time I noticed the sedan was near Wentzville, entering the highway a few cars behind my trailer. Light color, probably silver, too common a model to leave a lasting impression. It overtook two slower trucks shortly after I did the same. It didn't accelerate more than necessary. It just merged into the flow of traffic, maintaining a regular distance. Nothing there seemed out of the ordinary at that moment. I stopped to refuel and grab coffee in Kingdom City, a quick stop, less than 15 minutes. When I got back on the road, the traffic had completely changed. Even so, about 20 minutes later, the same sedan appeared in my right rearview mirror. It wasn't right behind me, it wasn't far away. It just reappeared as if it had waited for the same return window. As I approached Columbia, I started paying attention to the pattern. He never stayed parallel to my cabin. He never tried to overtake me to look, nor did he leave enough space to disappear completely. He would stay there, 2 or 3 vehicles behind, adjusting his speed too smoothly, as if he were following a fixed reference point. That's when I slowed down 5 miles per hour for no real reason, just to observe the reaction. An SUV overtook on the left. A pickup accelerated and disappeared ahead. The flow changed naturally. The sedan slowed down along with it, maintaining the same distance. It wasn't abrupt. It was too smooth, and from there the repetition became the norm. I maintained the reduced speed for a few more minutes and then returned to the normal pace of the track, as if nothing had changed. The sedan followed the adjustment with the same naturalness. No attempt to close the gap, no gestures, just consistency. That started to weigh more than if he had simply accelerated to pass. I took my phone from its holder on the dashboard and opened the traffic app, not for route planning but to observe the surrounding traffic. There was no congestion ahead that would justify such a controlled pace. There hadn't been a recent accident on that stretch of road either. It was an open, straight highway with clear visibility for miles. Nothing that would force anyone behind me to stay behind. I decided to make a quick stop at a large gas station just past Boonville, which was quite busy and had a shop open. I drove straight into the illuminated area near the central pumps. The sedan went straight past the entrance without slowing down. That almost convinced me I was overdoing it. Almost. I stayed there for 20 minutes, enough time for any vehicle to have already moved dozens of miles ahead. I returned to the road and stabilized at 65. About half an hour later, already outside the urban area, the same sedan reappeared in the rearview mirror. Same color, same model, same relative position. It was at that moment that something small caught my attention. A discreet sticker in the lower corner of the rear window, a dark rectangular shape. I hadn't noticed it before. Now it was clear enough to confirm it was the same car. 3 cities, 2 stops, and it was still there. I continued driving as if I hadn't confirmed anything, but I stopped using cruise control. I manually adjusted the speed a few times, alternating between 63 and 68 miles per hour on open stretches. The sedan followed each variation without overtaking. It wasn't close enough to seem aggressive, it was far enough away to seem casual. I drove through a section of roadworks with a mandatory reduction to 55 km/h. Cones narrowing the lane, temporary signs, compressed traffic. That would be the perfect spot for someone to lose interest or follow another flow of traffic. The sedan remained there. When the road reopened, it resumed its exact same position behind my trailer. I looked in the convex mirror and could see the driver better for the first time. Sunglasses, even though it was early afternoon. Head slightly tilted forward, posture too firm for someone just traveling. He wasn't holding a visible cell phone. He wasn't talking to passengers. He was just driving. My radio started picking up slight interference on the channel I usually use to listen to local news. No clear voices, just intermittent noise that came and went. I didn't immediately associate it with the car, but the coincidence was noticeable. I turned off the radio. The silence inside the cabin became more present than it should have been. A few miles later, my phone vibrated on the dashboard. Unknown number, local area code from Missouri. I didn't answer. The vibration stopped. 10 seconds later, it vibrated again. Same origin. And in the rear-view mirror, the sedan maintained exactly the same distance. The third call didn't come. A message did. A screen lit up on the dashboard mount while I was still looking in the rear-view mirror. Unknown number. No caller ID. Just a short line. You left St. Louis at 8:12. The time was correct. Not approximate. Exact. I didn't reply. I kept the truck steady in the right lane. A few seconds later, another message came in. Stopped in Kingdom City for 14 minutes. It wasn't 15, it wasn't 10. It was the real time. I felt my jaw clench before I even realized I was clenching my teeth. I looked in the mirror again. The sedan was still there. No closer. No further away. There was no attempt to overtake, to intimidate. There was no gesture. It was as if the information was being sent only to mark its presence, not to provoke an immediate reaction. The phone vibrated for the third time. Light charge. Blue seal. I hadn't disclosed that anywhere publicly. It wasn't visible from the outside without close enough proximity to read it directly. I hadn't mentioned it to anyone outside the company. And yet there it was, written on the screen. I considered braking suddenly and forcing a direct approach, but I ruled it out. On an open highway, confrontation becomes an unnecessary risk. The next message took almost 2 minutes to arrive, enough time to create the wrong expectation. When it arrived, it was even simpler. Keep driving. I maintained the route to the Blue Springs area, already entering the denser area before Kansas City, where traffic naturally compresses and mixes larger vehicles with passenger cars. The more movement around, the less chance of any direct approach. The sedan was still present, but began to change lanes more frequently, never to overtake, just to remain visible within my field of vision. It wanted to remain noticed, not hidden. Another message came through on my phone while I kept the right lane steady. Delivery at 1:30 p.m. The time was correct, recorded in the carrier's internal system. It wasn't information printed on the trailer. It wasn't on any visible document from the outside. This was no longer a casual observation on the road. It was access to operational data. I gradually reduced my speed to 60, then 58, letting other trucks create a natural barrier between us. A white box truck blocked my direct view of the sedan for a few minutes. When it reappeared, it was 2 lanes to the left, still parallel to my path. It neither approached nor disappeared. The phone vibrated again. No need to stop. The message contained no direct threat, no request for money, no demand for a change of route. It was simply a statement of situational control, the kind of phrase that doesn't require an immediate reaction, but completely alters how you hold the steering wheel. When I pulled into the company exit for dock check-in, signaling in advance, the sedan didn't follow me. It continued straight down the highway, blending into the urban traffic until it disappeared among the buildings and overpasses. No final message arrived. No attempt at physical contact occurred. Only the sudden silence after hours of constant presence. During the download, I mentally reviewed each stop and each time mentioned in the messages. There was no error in the information sent. The data was too precise for simple visual observation from the road. Someone had access to the records or was connected to some point in the operational chain. I spoke with the supervisor without dramatizing the situation, simply recounting the sequence and content of the messages. He suggested changing the password for the tracking app and reviewing the permissions linked to my profile. I did this right there in the yard, inside the cabin. A simple procedure, but necessary. On the empty return trip along the same I-70, no sedan reappeared in the rearview mirror. No unfamiliar number called again. The absence should have brought immediate relief, but it brought something else. When the pattern suddenly disappears, it doesn't vanish from the mind just as quickly. In the following weeks, I started varying my departure time without prior notice, changing coffee spots, and even switching gas stations. Nothing happened again. No new messages. No repeated cars in 3 cities, just regular traffic and a predictable routine. Even so, today I observe more than before. If a vehicle maintains a constant distance for too many miles, I mentally register its make and position. It could be a coincidence, it could just be aligned traffic. But on that Missouri route, someone showed that they didn't need to get close to my truck to become part of my routine. The object appeared in the headlight beam too late to be treated as ordinary debris. I was already slowing down when I realized it was positioned exactly on the ideal swerving line, not in the center of the lane. It was heavy enough to destroy the suspension if I drove straight over it, and it was too clean to have fallen from a moving truck. In that second, even before touching the brakes, I knew someone had placed it there expecting a reaction. I was driving through an industrial area south of Little Rock, Arkansas, using a detour that saves a few miles before reconnecting to the main highway. The warehouses were closed, metal doors down, old signs of companies that probably no longer operated there. The streetlights were too far apart, creating long corridors of shadow between one illuminated point and another. The asphalt had old patches that made the steering wheel vibrate constantly, but predictably. There wasn't a single other vehicle visible on that stretch at that time. The load consisted of industrial wire spools, securely fastened with reinforced straps, correctly distributed to maintain lateral stability and prevent sudden movement. Nothing flashy enough to immediately attract the attention of someone looking for easy cargo. The center of gravity was stable, and the trailer responded steadily to the gentle curves of that corridor. Documentation was in order. The seal checked at the originating yard before departure. It had been an operationally simple night up to that point. The clock on the dashboard read 11:40 p.m. when I entered the darkest part of the industrial area, where the lampposts didn't quite cover the entire width of the road. Late enough that any employees would have already left the area, but too early for frequent patrols to pass by. There wasn't a single car parked with its headlights on the sides. No loading dock showed any activity, just metal, concrete, and compressed silence. I was maintaining 45 miles per hour, respecting the local speed limit and avoiding stressing the suspension on the uneven, bumpy road surface. The high beams illuminated only what was directly ahead, leaving the sides partially obscured by shadow. It was in this narrow beam that the object appeared, partially across the right lane. It wasn't centered like something that had fallen while in motion. It was positioned exactly where a truck would naturally try to swerve. The moment I started to slow down without applying the brakes, something didn't add up in the scene before me. There were no skid marks leading up to where the object was positioned. There were no smaller fragments scattered around to indicate a previous impact. It was a single piece, heavy enough to cause real damage if struck at speed, and there was no accumulated dust to suggest it had been there for hours. I eased off the accelerator and let the truck slow down on its own before gradually applying the brakes, avoiding a sudden transfer of weight to the front. The object looked like an irregular concrete block, but it had something metallic embedded in one of its sides that reflected the headlights differently. It wasn't a common piece of abandoned construction or leftover debris on the road. It was aligned at an angle too precise to be careless, and it occupied exactly the width that would force a calculated swerve. As I adjusted the steering wheel slightly to the left, I noticed that the opposite lane was empty, but too dark to rely solely on initial impressions. The lighting didn't fully cover the sides, leaving blind spots outside the direct reach of the high beams. The reduction in speed was continuous, controlled, without any jolt that would suggest an exaggerated reaction. Even so, something about the scene seemed staged. It didn't look like an accident. The moment I lined up to pass by the building, I noticed a second shadow a few meters ahead, almost touching the curb on the right. Too small to be a parked vehicle, too tall to be a fixed pole or power box. It wasn't moving fast, but it also didn't seem like a permanent part of the landscape. It wasn't part of the usual scenery in that corridor. I considered stopping completely and assessing the situation with the high beams on, but I discarded the idea before completing my reasoning. Stopping in an empty industrial corridor reduces maneuverability and increases lateral vulnerability. I kept the truck rolling slowly without losing all momentum. The engine sound seemed louder inside the cab in that compressed silence. Every vibration seemed amplified. As I passed by the block, I could only see recent drag marks on the side facing my path. There was no accumulated dirt on the lower edges that would indicate days of exposure to traffic. The concrete still had a clean surface in specific spots as if it had been handled recently. It wasn't forgotten debris. It was a piece positioned to influence route decisions. As soon as the front axle passed the block, I checked in the right mirror to confirm that the trailer wouldn't touch the exposed metal edge. The rear passed with minimal clearance, without visible impact, but too close for real comfort. It was at that moment that the shadow on the right moved half a step back, almost imperceptible under the dim light of the more distant lamppost. There was no running or abrupt movement, just a silent adjustment of position, as if recalculating something. I continued moving slowly for a few more meters, keeping the truck aligned in the exact center of the lane. The lane ahead remained too empty for that particular time of night. No headlights appeared on the industrial horizon, no external noise besides my own engine echoing between the metal facades. The absence of any immediate reaction was more unsettling than direct confrontation. In the left mirror, I caught a quick reflection coming from the side of a closed shed, something like glass catching light for a fraction of a second. There was no open window there, just a corrugated metal door and a faded sign. The reflection disappeared as quickly as it appeared, without a clear reappearance. It could have been a lens. It could have been something else. But it didn't match an ordinary surface. I kept a firm grip on the steering wheel and began to accelerate gradually, reaching 40 miles per hour before reaching the end of the industrial stretch. There were no vehicles exiting from side streets. No engines were running behind me. No horns broke the heavy silence of the area. The street remained empty as if the block had never been there. When I looked again in the right rearview mirror, the object was already diminishing in my field of vision under the dim light of the spaced-out streetlights. The shadow that had moved was no longer in the same spot where I had seen it seconds before. It also wasn't lying on the ground or exposed to the side. It simply wasn't visible. And that confirmed that the test had been about reaction, not about collision. I had already picked up speed by almost 50 miles per hour when I noticed in the rearview mirror a headlight turning on behind one of the warehouses I had left behind in the industrial corridor. The light wasn't positioned directly on the main road. It was slightly recessed, as if the vehicle were hidden in a side access. It didn't immediately enter the road. It only remained there for a few seconds before going out again. I continued through 2 more industrial blocks until I reached the traffic light that connects that stretch to the main highway. The light was green when I approached, but it turned yellow a few meters before the stop line. I could have accelerated and passed without technical risk. I preferred to slow down and stop completely. Remaining motionless for a few seconds, there seemed like a more controlled decision. While waiting for the light to change, I continuously checked my rearview mirrors, alternating between left, right, and the lower convex mirror. No car appeared immediately behind me. No light turned at the previous corner in that short interval. The industrial corridor darkened again with no visible traffic lights returning to the road. Yet the feeling of closure didn't come with the absence. When the light turned green, I entered the main highway, maintaining a progressive and constant acceleration. 2 ordinary cars overtook me on the left, without slowing down to observe the trailer. A few seconds later, a dark pickup truck appeared from the same industrial exit, but maintained a regular distance. I couldn't confirm if it was the same headlight I had seen before. I drove for approximately 15 miles until I reached a well-lit gas station just outside that isolated industrial zone. I parked under direct sunlight and got out for a complete inspection of the vehicle, starting from the front. No visible damage to the suspension. No recent marks on the tire. Operationally, everything was normal. But the block hadn't been installed there to protect against impact, and that was all too obvious. As I walked around the truck under the bright lights of the gas station, I mentally reconstructed the exact position of the block and the angle at which it was oriented on the road. It wasn't heavy enough to completely block a semi-truck. It was heavy enough to force a sharp downshift and quick decision-making. The choice of location wasn't accidental. It was placed where the lighting was poor and where the margin for reaction would be limited. I returned to the cabin and reviewed the time between the initial visualization and the resumption of normal speed. It was only a few seconds, but enough for someone to observe the decision-making pattern under real pressure. If I had slammed on the brakes abruptly, I would have created a rear vulnerability. If I had stopped completely, I would have allowed time for a side approach. The difference between continuing to roll and stopping completely changes the scenario. No vehicle consistently followed me after I left the industrial area. The pickup truck that had appeared at the exit turned onto another road a few minutes later. There was no clear pursuit recorded on the main highway. Traffic returned to its usual early morning pattern. Even so, the episode was not improvised. The following day, during the routine inspection at the destination yard, I asked them to check the suspension and alignment preventively. No damage was identified. However, the internal report recorded an extra technical stop and an unscheduled inspection. This caused a slight delay in the next route. Operationally small, but real. There was no structural damage to the truck, but there was an indirect cost in terms of time and schedule reorganization. I altered my rest period that week due to the accumulated delay. Small changes that affect the next delivery window. The block didn't cause a collision. It caused an operational adjustment. And that was already enough to meet the test objective. Since that night in Arkansas, I've started paying attention not only to what's in the center of the road, but mainly to what seems too out of place to be casual. Objects at specific angles. Debris that's too clean for an abandoned area. Excessive silence in a zone that should have some residual noise. Small signs that would have gone unnoticed before now factor into the calculation. I didn't go back to using that industrial shortcut after 10 o'clock at night, even though it saves a few miles on the total journey. The main highway may be longer, but it offers open visibility and a steady flow of traffic. Predictable conditions reduce the margin for silent roadblocks. Fuel savings don't compensate for prepared lane splitting. There was never any subsequent contact. No exact repetition of the same mechanics in that specific region. What remained was not a direct threat or declared persecution. It was confirmation that someone set up a scenario to measure reaction under controlled pressure, and chose not to proceed beyond the initial test. Today, when I slow down in front of any obstacle at night in an isolated area, the assessment is automatic and cold. It could be fallen cargo debris, it could be neglect in urban maintenance, or it could be strategic positioning expecting a predictable response. This possibility changes the way I evaluate every meter of asphalt. In that industrial corridor of Arkansas, the block receded in the rearview mirror and disappeared into the darkness without generating a direct confrontation. There was no shouting, no armed approach, no cinematic chase. Just a heavy object placed in the right spot, and someone observing the decision. If you made it all the way to the end, subscribe. Most people watching aren't subscribed, and that small click makes a big difference for the channel. Like the video if you enjoyed it, and tell me which story stayed with you the most.